Item of business is a debate on motion 13090 in the name of Megan Gallagher on implementing the CAS review in Scotland. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Megan Gallagher to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday I attended the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee to hear directly from Dr Hilary Cass following her review into gender care services for children and young people. I had hoped to ask the question, but despite emailing the committee on Friday, was told that they had run out of time. Unfortunately, this was just the latest in a series of questions I have raised on this topic, which have been rejected or denied. But the fact of the matter is, Presiding Officer, children, young people, parents and campaign groups deserve answers. And that's why my party has brought forward a debate on this issue to Parliament today. Talking about gender in Scotland has become toxic, but we need to be clear. The CAS review is not about ideology. It is a scientific, evidence-based review of the medical care we've been given to vulnerable young children. It is a monumental and fearless piece of work. And I say fearless because even amid the toxicity of the gender debate, this crucial report did not shy away from its difficult findings. Namely, that we have been letting down a generation of vulnerable and distressed children. You would think that the publication of a damning report into the medical care of children would jump straight to the top of any government's entry, that politicians of all stripes would be united in wanting to make sure the mistakes and poor practices were stopped immediately and the required improvements would be put into place. But the response from this SNP government couldn't have been more lacklustre. From the moment the CAS review was commissioned 4 years ago, the SNP government sought to dismiss it as irrelevant to Scotland, even though the medical approaches being reviewed were almost identical to those being used here. They disregarded the interim report, which cast doubt on the safety of puberty blockers for children, and when the final report was published last month, they dithered, delayed and obfuscated until clinicians took the decision out of their hands, announcing that NHS Scotland would pause the use of puberty blockers for under 18s. But while the use of puberty blockers is undoubtedly one of the key aspects of the CAS review, this near 400-page document puts forward a total of 32 recommendations to improve gender care here in Scotland for young people. They include offering children fertility counselling before they proceed down a medical pathway, assigning a child a medical practitioner to take charge of their care and make sure they get the personalised help that they need, support for parents, carers or siblings if needed, and a requirement to keep national data set on gender services to continually update best practices. On these and a host of other reasonable common sense recommendations, the SNP has continued to be deafeningly silent on this issue. Presiding Officer, I made a promise to families who have been failed by gender care services in Scotland, and I intend to keep raising the issue until this Scottish Government implements all 32 recommendations of the CAS review without delay. The CAS report should fundamentally change how we look at gender care in Scotland. It should be approached with caution and care and given holistically, viewing a child as a rounded individual and tailoring the approach to their unique needs. Yes, her report concludes that there is little evidence to support the use of puberty-suppressing hormones, but it also details that children and young people might not be offered the right psychological support and assessments when experiencing gender distress. Medical intervention is not always required, yet that has been common practice for many individuals. Meanwhile, children's mental health has been left to deteriorate. Although the Sandiford Clinic has finally paused the use of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for those under the age of 18, gender care services needs a complete overhaul, and the Scottish Government needs to make this a priority. Because, as it stands, the waiting times for children and young people able to see a clinician at a gender clinic can be over 4 years. CAM's waiting times through the roof. And the SNP have remodelled funding of gender care services, which has resulted in a cut to their budget. So, regardless of your opinion on the cash review, regardless of your opinion on gender care services, the Scottish Government is failing young people. I certainly will.
Rachel Hamilton.
Does Megan Gallagher believe that there's no excuse now for the SNP to implement the recommendations of the cash review now that they have broken up their tragic coalition with the Greens?
Megan Gallagher.
Absolutely. This is an opportunity to reset, refocus and actually prioritise young people who need this government's support. Presiding officer, the cash review is a 4-year-long, near 400-page report into the care we give to some of our country's most vulnerable children. The fact that we've been failing them for so long is bad enough, and we should all reflect on that. But to ignore this scientific, evidence-based report for the sake of dogma and ideology would be unforgivable. This is about the health and safety, well-being of our young people. There is no other NHS services that we allow to continue to be unchanged after a report like this is brought forward, and it showed that they were failing. And this should be no different. Next week, I am holding an event here in Parliament with Marion Scott from the Sunday Post. This will be an opportunity for MSPs, ministers and cabinet secretaries to speak with families implemented by gender care and hear how they have been failed by the processes in place here in Scotland. I do urge all MSPs, regardless of their persuasion, regardless of their political parties, to speak to the families who have bravely stepped forward to tell their stories. Presiding officer, I think it's clear that we need to implement all 32 recommendations of the cash review. That is what our motion says today. It is simple, but it will show this Parliament that we care about young people who are experiencing gender distress. And the message I have for MSPs is that if you don't back our motion today to implement the full recommendations of the cash review, then they will need to explain to the families why they haven't, because they're the ones who have been impacted by the lack of decision and action by this Scottish Government. Thank you.
Ms Gallagher, could I please ask you to move the motion? Thank you.
I move the motion.
Many thanks. I now call on Jenny Minto to speak to and move Amendment 13090.4 on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 5 minutes, please, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Just over 2 weeks ago, I stood in this chamber to emphasise what is undeniably a fact, that young people questioning their gender, accessing gender identity healthcare, their families and those that love them must be at the centre of all our discussions about delivery of this care. I hope we all keep them in our hearts and minds during the rest of this debate, and in doing so remain compassionate, understanding and respectful. As I said in my statement, it is vitally important that the recommendations in the CAS Review's final report published in April are carefully considered. The Scottish Government has consistently welcomed its publication. The review itself was chaired by a past president of the UK's Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, a senior and well-respected clinician. Many of us will have heard her helpful and clear evidence at the Health and Social Care Committee yesterday, and I recognise the CAS Review's final report is a scientific, evidence-based document. When Dr Cass was asked yesterday for her key conclusions from the review, she said two things. First, the evidence base in this specialist field of medicine is weak, and we need to work as collaboratively and broadly as we can to improve that evidence base. And second, that children and young people need a broad, multidisciplinary approach to their care. I think all of us in this chamber would agree with these 2 points. The Scottish Government has already provided grant funding to the University of Glasgow to carry out research into the long-term health outcomes of people accessing gender identity healthcare. This will play a part in improving the evidence base. And person-centred, holistic, multidisciplinary care has been at the heart of our Chief Medical Officer's realistic medicine approach for many years. Our clinicians know how important it is to see the whole person they care for. The final report is detailed and wide-ranging. It is important that its recommendations are carefully considered in the context of how services are delivered in NHS Scotland and consider what further steps may need to be taken. As I made clear, I'm going to make progress. As I made clear in my statement, a senior multidisciplinary clinical team within the Chief Medical Officer's Directorate in the Scottish Government, which includes paediatric pharmacy and scientific expertise, is carrying out this careful consideration. As Parliament would expect, this work is already underway. The Chief Medical Officer will provide a written update to Parliament on the outcome of that clinical consideration process before the summer recess. I'll take Rachel Hamilton's intervention.
Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Minister. In the statement that you made, you said that the discussions are ongoing between clinical stakeholders and what further involvement may be appropriate, and the Chief Scientist Officer is involved. But how long is that going to take? Can you put a timeline on those discussions, please?
I thank Rachel Hamilton for her intervention. The Chief Medical Officer will provide a written update to Parliament on the outcome of that clinical consideration process before the summer recess. I'm sure colleagues across the Chamber will welcome this assessment and understand, just as NHS England have stated, that given the comprehensiveness of the report, this will take some time. I'll take Ash Regan's.
Ash Regan.
I thank the Minister for giving way. The Minister has just set out that the CMO will seek to provide a written statement to the Parliament on the progress that's being made. But could I ask the Government to consider that it might be advisable for the CMO to appear in Parliament to aid that scrutiny?
Minister.
I thank Ash Regan for her intervention. Currently, the CMO is going to provide a written statement, and that's the way that I think it should be delivered to Parliament. I also know colleagues across the Chamber would not want a knee-jerk reaction to a 400-page report that has not properly considered how services in Scotland are delivered, or what work on training or on standards is already underway. I need to make progress. As part of our work, the Scottish Government is clear there needs to be transparency. We therefore agree that the CMO will write to Parliament, as I've said, reporting in full all of the clinical findings of the senior multidisciplinary clinical team, and to prepare a progress report on the existing strategy for reducing long waits for children and young people to access specialist gender services. On this basis, and to find consensus, we will accept the Labour Party's amendment. I hope all of us can agree that this consensus will be helpful for the young people involved, their families, clinicians and health professionals delivering gender identity health care. Presiding Officer, it did not take the publication of this report for the Scottish Government to start a broad programme of work to improve gender identity health care. It is important to note that in Scotland we're already making progress on several aspects of gender identity health care highlighted in the Cass review. Dr Cass reminds us in her report that a compassionate and kind society remembers that there are real children, young people, families, carers and clinicians behind the headlines. And I hope that this sentiment is one that we can all keep in mind in today's debate and as we progress. I move the amendment.
Thank you, Minister. I now call on Jackie Bailey to speak to and move Amendment 13090.2. Up to 4 minutes, please, Ms Bailey.
Presiding Officer, the Cass Review is a considered, evidence-based report drawn up by experts. Led by Dr Hilary Cass, the former President of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, and involving clinicians and young people themselves. And we must not ignore her conclusions, no matter how difficult they may be, as failure to implement all those that apply to the NHS in Scotland will let down both staff and a generation of young people and their families. So let me turn to the Scottish Government's response first. The pretence that they knew nothing about it and needed lots of time to consider it, frankly, doesn't hold water. Meetings have taken place with Dr Cass, senior clinicians and the Scottish Government well before publication of her final report. And just to be clear, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer was there, along with a host of senior government officials. And let's not forget that there was also an interim report that set out the direction of travel quite clearly. The lack of leadership from the SNP government has in fact been woeful, because the unseemly backwards and forwards between the Scottish Government and health boards about who would make the announcement about the pause in puberty blockers was, I thought, quite disgraceful, because instead of taking ownership, the Minister chose to leave the burden to clinicians. The same clinicians that have expressed concerns about the toxicity of the conversation on gender services, that is leaving them vulnerable and exposed. No wonder NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde have struggled to recruit consultants at the Sandyford. Staff at the Sandyford Clinic do an incredible job, but they're not adequately supported to do so. Now, the Scottish Government published the NHS Gender Identity Services Strategic Action Framework in 2021, and we welcomed it. And the National Gender Identity Healthcare Reference Group was set up in March 2022 to oversee implementation of the framework. Just to note, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer is a co-chair. Now, the reference group's latest minutes report that the negative impact of the ongoing polarised public discussion has taken a toll on the recruitment of staff in gender services. Dr Cass herself echoed these concerns in her report, stating, "There are few other areas of healthcare where professionals are so afraid to openly discuss their views, where people are vilified on social media and where name-calling echoes the worst bullying behaviour. This must stop, and the government must take leadership in this area." But it also impacts on recruitment, and it has a knock-on effect on waiting lists. Now, I remember when the framework was published, I think waiting lists were sitting at about 4 years. They're now sitting at about 4.5 years for young people and 5.5 years for adults. That is unthinkable. So can I ask the Minister, why is she bypassing the already established National Gender Identity Healthcare Reference Group? Why is this new group being set up when you have one with all that expertise sitting round the table? And how is it intended to link the two, or will they exist in splendid isolation of each other? And I understand National Services Scotland is in the middle of commissioning gender services. Will this include the use of puberty blockers and hormone treatments, and from what age? These are critical questions. But let me deal briefly with the Labour amendment. I'm just about to close. We've asked for openness and transparency, with the new working group publishing papers and minutes. The Government, I understand, will partially agree to this, and that is indeed welcome. It is, after all, a government-established working group, and this is a matter of such importance we cannot have secrecy at the heart of government. We are also asking for a report on the progress of the framework and the difference being made to gender identity services, which we believe is urgently required, because we cannot allow waiting times to spiral out of control, and that means we need to seriously address recruitment, and that requires leadership from the very top. Presiding Officer, I recognise I need to close, but I think what we're doing here is critically important for the young people experiencing gender dysphoria, and it's too important for us to get wrong. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you, Ms Bailey. I now call on Gillian Mackay on behalf of Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please, Ms Mackay.
Thanks, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's undeniable that homophobia and transphobia are on the rise, and that's absolutely true when it comes to the weaponisation of the Cass review. The debate today, I believe, is at the very best premature, and it's absolutely right that government takes its time to assess the implications of this report, if there are any, for the Scottish NHS. We do have to be aware that this was a review of services...
Members, please have some courtesy and respect to the Speaker who has the floor. Ms Mackay.
We do have to be aware that this was a review of services and treatment pathways in NHS England, which differ to those in Scotland. As many have said in the Chamber before, not all will be applicable to Scotland, and in fact some may be irrelevant given it was an analysis of a different health service. Hence why I believe this debate is at its best premature. For those recommendations which may be relevant, there are then choices to be made about whether those require action or not. Any changes that are made should also include input from trans young people who have been through the service and those who are on waiting lists and their families. Many have hailed this report as the end of gender-affirming care, but Dr Cass at the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee yesterday confirmed that both puberty blockers and hormones are the correct way forward for some children and young people who are seeking gender identity care. I think it's important that we're really clear here that in providing gender-affirming care, medical transition may not be the correct course of action for everyone, and that timeframes for transition differ between people. What we absolutely have to do is ensure that services are improved, both in terms of the pathways and the current models of care, and by tackling the issue of long waits. Yes.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank the member for giving way on that point. Does she agree with me that one of the key risks that was raised at the committee this week was that the long wait lists, 4.5 years on average, lead to a lot of young people self-medicating, which introduced in itself a lot of risks to young people?
Gillian Mackay.
Yes, absolutely. And also the other thing that was highlighted at committee was the ongoing distress and mental health issues for young people, for those waiting on long waits as well. Listening to the debate so far, many could believe that the overwhelming experience of gender identity services is negative. For some, their most negative experience is about waiting times and not getting the care they receive. Many have said that receiving the gender-affirming care they needed was life-saving, brought joy and allowed them to be their true selves. That doesn't mean that services don't need improved. As well as waiting times, clinician confidence in providing care is also a very current and live issue. In their briefing ahead of this debate, Scottish Trans noted, at the moment in Scotland, there are far too few healthcare practitioners who feel confident supporting children and young people who are exploring or feeling distressed about their gender identity. Scottish Trans hear frequently from young people who try to seek support for non-gender related distress, such as depression or anxiety, or who are referred on to specialist gender identity services, if they also disclose that they're feeling uncertain about their gender identity or that they're trans. This then means that young people are put onto extremely long waiting lists, sometimes for years, with no support in the meantime, and this situation is totally unacceptable. It's vital that, in general, children and young people's mental health services and wider health services are able to provide support to all young people within their area of expertise, and this clearly highlights the need for more training. One of the commitments in the Scottish Strategic Action Framework to improve gender identity services is the development of a transgender knowledge and skills framework that could result in the upskilling of healthcare practitioners across the NHS on providing care for trans people. And I'd be grateful if the Minister could provide any update on work on that in her summing up. I remain concerned about what the ongoing debates here and on social media is doing for those young people who are just trying to access the care they need and have been thrust into an increasingly heated and partisan political storm. This very small group of young people, and they need our support and not our judgment.
Thank you, Ms Mackay. And I now call on Alex Gough-Hamilton on behalf of Scottish Liberal Democrats. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I am grateful for the opportunity to speak for the Liberal Democrats in this important debate. And it is a sensitive matter, but it is nevertheless, as I say, an important debate on a substantial clinical review. As such, we should approach it with a sense of understanding, compassion and with tolerance, something that Dr Hilary Cass rightly pointed out as being profoundly absent from so much of this debate in our community. Each of us has a duty to model and uphold the values on which this Parliament was founded, and as parliamentarians we have a duty to consider these matters soberly with reason underpinned by evidence, but that consideration must always remember the people, especially the young people, at the very heart of this debate. In her report, Dr Cass rightly underscores the impact of delays, and I thank Paul Sweeney for his intervention there, and she reiterated this at committee, and that has profound impact on mental health and can even lead to self-medication and self-harm. There's also the stigma and toxicity of debate that she denotes can have on already vulnerable lives. We must heed her words and consider her review without the intolerance and invective that characterises so much of this debate in our communities. Scottish Liberal Democrats believe that when it comes to children and young people, our focus should always be on ensuring their well-being and preventing harm. That every young person has as much agency as their age and capacity allows, and that their voice is at the centre of every decision that impacts them. It is essential, therefore, also that there is a scientific basis for everything we do. The Scottish Liberal Democrats accept the clinical validity of this review. It is a substantial piece of work, and it is right that we take time to consider its findings and work through each of the 32 recommendations as to how they might best apply to care pathways here in Scotland. Ultimately, we think that it's right that decisions about safety and efficacy of treatments are always made by clinicians and not politicians. And with respect to Megan Gallagher, I don't believe that decision should ever have rested here with government ministers. It should always rest with people like the Sandiford Clinic. And in response to the recommendations of the Cass Review, I'm afraid I don't have time. I only have 4 minutes. NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde has paused the use of puberty blockers at that clinic to allow for relevant clinicians to review all necessary evidence and for more to be obtained. But that reality is not without its own challenges. Presiding officer, there will be a number of young people, a very small number of young people, but they exist nevertheless, for whom that decision will represent a massive setback, who had already waited far too long, were already in profound distress and thought themselves on a threshold of that care pathway, only to find that they now have that intervention closed off to them. They deserve heightened levels of support in terms of the impact this will undoubtedly have on their mental health. Where a young person or their family raises questions about the suspension of this approach, it's right that health boards and clinicians engage, are clear of what that decision means and ensure there is still access to high-quality healthcare and support. Dr Cass has recommended the suspension of such interventions because of the lack of a clear evidential basis to support their use. That is perhaps the biggest challenge of the report, and it is one that Liberal Democrats will not shy away from. Presiding officer, no decision in human history has not been improved by the addition of a firm evidential footing. So we owe it now to the young people at the very heart of this to establish that scientific basis with the utmost care, but also with all possible speed, so that they and their clinicians can make the most informed decisions possible about their ongoing care. Presiding officer, trans healthcare has always been a poor relation to our consideration of public health of any kind in this place, and that matters, but it matters. And above all, we need to ensure that any consideration of such issues is conducted in cognizance of the challenge at the very heart of the Cass review. That is to move forward with compassion, with evidence, and above all, without toxicity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Cole-Hamilton. We will now move to the open debate. I would advise members we have no time in hand and backbench speeches are up to 4 minutes maximum. With that, I call Murdo Fraser to be followed by Ruth McGuire. Mr Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Sinead Watson is one of the bravest people I have ever met. Sinead is a detransitioner, someone I first heard speak in this Parliament 4 years ago in an event hosted by the then SNP MSP Joan McAlpin. Sinead today is 33. 10 years ago, she transitioned to become a man, having had a history of being a victim of sexual assault by men. She came to believe that her problems would be cured if she underwent gender reassignment treatment, and having presented as gender dysphoric at the Sanderford Gender Clinic in Glasgow, went down the route of transition. She had years of testosterone injections and a double mastectomy. Today, Sinead is in permanent pain and discomfort and bears both the physical and mental scars of that transition. She now realises she made a terrible mistake, but the treatment she underwent means there is no going back to the body she once had. Sinead is angry. She is angry that clinicians who should have recognised that what she needed was therapy encouraged her down the route of gender transition. She is angry that the consequences of what she was doing were not fully laid out to her. And she is angry that the prospect that at some point in the future she might want to detransition was never set out to her. Sinead, like many detransitioners, wants the Sandyford Clinic closed because of the damage that is being done. And in her words, I will do what I can to stop this terrible mistreatment of vulnerable young people. And Sinead is, rightly, angry with politicians who encourage these transitions for children and young people with troubled backgrounds and a history of mental illness. So, Presiding Officer, the Cass report is a welcome step towards changing our perspective on the treatment of young people with gender issues. We should not be prepared to tolerate any young person going through what Sinead Watson had to suffer. And that is why the rapid implementation of the recommendations of the Cass report is so important, as set out by Megan Gallagher. Yes, I will, briefly.
Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Murdo Fraser. Hilary Cass at the Health Committee said that the issue of puberty blockers has become almost totemic, and it has stopped us from looking at the issues that young people are having in terms of coping with their distress. And I think that's a very important point.
Murdo Fraser.
Yes, I agree with that point. There's much more in the Cass report that needs to take our attention. I believe that children and young people in Scotland should not be left behind, while children in England are given the protections that are required. Now, our new First Minister, John Swinney, has spoken a lot in the last few days about the need for a new approach for his government. And I hope we will see that, because the comments we have seen from some in the Green Party in relation to the Cass report are simply disgraceful, with one MSP sharing on social media a comment that it was transphobic. It is a rich irony that the party which demands we follow the science when it comes to climate issues then rejects the science when it doesn't support their political prejudice. So if the First Minister is serious about a new approach and reaching out to other parties, this is his opportunity to reject the Greens, to embrace the Cass report and show kindness, compassion and care for children and young people in Scotland. Because we should not be permitting the mutilation of young bodies in the name of an anti-science ideology. And those who committed these atrocities, and those in this place and elsewhere who stood by and let this happen, or worse still, actively encouraged it, should not be forgiven. Presiding Officer, let me say one more thing as I close. Members might recall some years ago in a debate on the SNP's programme for government, when I referred to the fact that I'd met women outside this Parliament protesting against the Gender Reform Bill. I was heckled by the former First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, from a sedentary position with the words, "Shame on you." Well, Presiding Officer, I feel no shame whatsoever for speaking up for the rights of women and girls. And any shame that falls to be apportioned should be laid firmly at the door of the former First Minister, her ministers and all in here who allowed this abuse to occur in furtherance of a toxic ideology. I hope that in time they will have the good grace to apologise for the damage they have done to Sinead and to others. It is the very least that they should do.
Thank you. I would remind members we have no time in hand, and I call Ruth McGuire to be followed by Pauline McNeill. Ms McGuire.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was very grateful yesterday to have the opportunity to question Dr Cass at the Health Committee. The landmark Cass report into gender identity services in England is a serious and substantial piece of work which should be considered carefully by all those with an interest and responsibility for children's health. Understanding, of course, that it did not specifically examine services in Scotland, there are a number of principles that Scotland can learn from. For me, the key thing is that it calls on services for children and young people with gender dysphoria to operate to the same standards as other services seeing children and young people with complex presentations and/or additional risk factors. I would hope that that is a principle that everyone would be able to get behind. It states that children and young people referred to NHS gender services must receive a holistic assessment of their needs to inform an individualised care plan, and that should include screening for neurodevelopmental conditions, including autism spectrum disorder, and a mental health assessment. And that standard evidence-based psychological and psychopharmacological treatment approaches should be used to support the management of the associated distress from gender incongruence and co-occurring conditions, including support for parents, carers and siblings as appropriate. Presiding Officer, everything that we know about children and young people points to better outcomes with parental carer guardian support, and I know that many parents will be reassured by the fact that they are mentioned and included in much of the report. It talks to how services should establish a separate pathway for prepubertal children and their families, ensuring that they are prioritised for early discussion about how parents can best support their child in a balanced and non-judgmental way. When families and carers are making decisions about social transitioning of prepubertal children, services should ensure that they can be seen as early as possible by a clinical professional with relevant experience. I note as well concerns about the implications of private health care on any future requests for the NHS for treatment. Presiding Officer, back in 2022, I hosted a meeting for colleagues which gave them the chance to hear directly from people who had detransitioned. I want to take the opportunity to thank Sinead Watson and Richie Herring. They spoke candidly and at times emotionally about their experiences, and I know that colleagues from across the chamber who attended valued their courage and generosity in doing so. I'm pleased that the report states a need for provision for people considering detransition, recognising that they will not want to re-engage with the services whose care they were previously under. I have thought about Sinead and Richie a lot over the last few years, and I hope that improvements to services can help other people, help prevent other people going through the pain and distress that they have. Finally, Presiding Officer, in the report and in committee there was some discussion around conversion therapy. No formal science-based training in psychotherapy, psychology or psychiatry teaches or advocates conversion therapy. It's really important that if we legislate in this place, we don't restrict the ability of therapists to go about their jobs and explore with people the issues that they are having. I said at the start, this is a serious, substantial, scientific report. It needs serious consideration. I'll support the Government's amendment and Labour's on that regard. Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Maguire. I now call Pauline McNeill to be followed by Brian Whittle. Ms McNeill.
We should be indebted to the work of Dr Hilary Cass and the sensitive way that she has approached this issue. In fact, that she's taken the time to come to Scotland to answer detailed questions is to her credit. I believe it is a watershed moment. But she did serve to highlight the lack of urgency that the Government have in acting on this report. The methodical and thorough way that she examined the issues around gender identity services will serve not only to protect more young people from harm, but also show, as demonstrated, that there are many different pathways for young people who are distressed about different aspects of their life, whether it's gender identity. And I do agree that waiting times for gender health care are unacceptably long. But I don't believe there's any excuse not to implement this report in full. Ministers in this government, as Jackie Baillie had said in her opening speech, behaved as though the findings had just arrived, when anyone who had been following this in the press for the last 2 or 3 years will be fully aware of the whistleblowing around the Tavistock Clinic and the follow-on report from Hilary Cass, so it's no surprise to any government. But the review has highlighted the lack of evidence and raised concerns about the potential harm of treatments, particularly puberty blockers and hormone therapies. And others have pointed out that these are major life-altering interventions, and the review states we have no good evidence on the long-term outcomes of interventions to manage gender-related distress. It's also deeply worrying to me that it was allowed to happen in our NHS, ending up offering experimental treatment to vulnerable children without having proper evidence for its safety. And when giving evidence to the committee yesterday, Dr Cass said the issue of puberty blockers has become almost totemic, and she said that it has stopped us looking at other ways of managing young people's distress, something that I think is really important. Other leading figures have shared her view. The Chief of the British Medical Journal, Cameron Abbasi, has noted that a spiralling interventionist approach in the context of an evidence void amounted to over-medicalising care for vulnerable young people. I'm also pleased that Dr Hilary Cass has flagged up the issue in schools, children being socially transitioned without parental involvement. As she says, it is not helpful to the young people themselves to create an adversarial system. But we do need to look at the bigger picture here, because almost 2/3 of referrals to the Gender Identity Development Service in London in recent years for teenage girls. So more questions need to be asked about why a higher portion of girls are presenting for gender dysphoria. And based on the Hilary Cass recommendations, we should not make any assumptions about this complex picture until we know the facts. The Cass Review is a robust piece of independent research, importantly informed by the views of people with lived experience. Gender medicine is built, as she says, on shaky foundations, and it's deeply worrying for child welfare. I urge the Government to get on with implementing the Cass recommendations now.
Thank you, Ms McNeill. And I now call Brian Whittle to be followed by Claire Hockey. Mr Whittle.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think it's fair to say that the Gender Rights Debate and Bill has been the most contentious piece of legislation this Parliament has had to deal with in my time here. I remember well the Stage 2 amendments I was involved with in committee and in Stage 3 in this chamber. My amendments were all around ensuring the safe health care for the trans community and how we deal with the fair inclusion of the trans community in the sports arena. In both these areas, the obvious importance of biology is evident. In fact, the impact of biology on these issues is irrefutable as gravity. Yet during that debate, in which I have to say we tried so hard to be constructive and as sensitive as we possibly could, all these facts were discarded. And can I say, Deputy Presiding Officer, of all my conversations I've had around the Gender Reform Act, the most grounded and sensible conversations have been with the trans community itself, not with those who pertain to represent them in this place. However, Deputy Presiding Officer, roll forward to the cash review, and this is where some MSPs' opinions drift into the realms of dangerous ideology over patient safety. The cash review noted that long-term effects of treatment like puberty blockers were yet unknown, and they could be causing irreversible harm. In any other medical treatment, there would be no question of that treatment needing to be paused for adults, let alone for vulnerable prepubescent teenagers. The report also highlights the need for a holistic assessment to include screening for neurodevelopmental conditions, including autism spectrum disorder and a mental health assessment. Healthcare professionals have a duty of care to offer the appropriate healthcare, not what some MSPs in here think is appropriate. Dr Cass warned that the risk of starting that transition at a point when someone is still in the process of development is you give the treatment to the wrong person. She went on to say that the reason that there is a negative outcome is because medical transition does not come without cost in terms of sexual function, fertility, knowns and unknowns about long-term bone health risks and the limitations of surgery. Now, all those costs, which are well worthwhile if you have a long-term stable trans identity, but it's a high cost to pay in the long term if you don't. And we should not forget, Deputy Presiding Officer, according to the Scottish Government's Justice Bill, a young person's neurological pathway is not fully developed until they're 25. So how on earth can we expect a child in their teens, in the midst of dealing with hormones associated with puberty, to make such monumental, life-changing decisions? Deputy Presiding Officer, I always try not to stray into questioning personal actions. However, given the Scottish Government at least recognising the Cass review as a credible piece of scientific work, although they are yet to adopt its recommendations, I find it absolutely disgraceful that the then Minister, Patrick Harvey, went on to national television to try and discredit the review, saying that there were so-called experts who questioned that review and on the basis was perfectly happy to continue as if the review had never been published, and ignore the potential harm to these children and the harm to the trans community. And I say to Patrick Harvey, there are also so-called experts who say there's no such thing as climate change. Presumably, given your attitude to Cass, you'll be listening to those alternative experts. No, Mr Harvey, you don't get to choose your experts and deny others just to fit your ideology, especially when it's the health of our children that's at stake. Those of us with children and grandchildren recognise the turmoil of their journey through puberty towards adulthood. They certainly don't need the dangerous views of people like Patrick Harvey being foisted upon them. He should never have been allowed anywhere near a decision when it comes to our children's welfare and the welfare of the trans community. And that's the crux here, Deputy Presiding Officer. What the Green Amendment risks is the long-term health of our children at the early stages of life when they're ready at an unstable point in their development. The Scottish Government can see sense here now, and they're not shackled to the Greens, and implement the recommendations of Cass review, which is applicable to NHS services in Scotland. And I urge the Chamber to support the motion in the name of my colleague Megan Gallagher, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Wizzle. I call Claire Hockey to be followed by Ash Regan. Ms Hockey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I refer members to my register of interests. I hold a bank nurse contract with Greater Glasgow and Clyde NHS. The publication of the Cass report has probably produced more column inches in newspapers, more social media posts and more worry and anxiety in the patient group it relates to than any other report I can remember. This important inquiry under the direction of Dr Hilary Cass into gender identity services in NHS England should be treated with the utmost respect. And I do think that this is a point that should be emphasised, that the report is about NHS England services, and we must take the time to cross-reference it accurately and thoroughly to our own services here in Scotland. And consideration of its many recommendations and its applicability to services in Scotland should be measured and assessed properly. I welcome the decisions by clinicians in both NHS Lothian and NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde to pause prescribing some pharmacological treatments. It's vitally important that clinical decisions are made by clinicians. And whilst we all recognise that this can be a very polarising topic, we cannot lose sight of the children and young people and, of course, their families who seek help with gender identity issues. These past few weeks will have been a very difficult time for children and young people affected by the recent changes in clinical pathways. One of uncertainties about how their current treatment and of what treatment options will be available to them. One of my young constituents contacted me last night, and these are her words. I'm 13, and I've been on the waiting list for the gender clinic since I was 11. I'm a girl. I don't want to be forced to develop as a male. I just want to be happy for the rest of my childhood. But now the gender clinic won't help me. I've previously asked the Minister for Public Health and Women's Health what support was being put in place while there has been a pause in the prescription of puberty blockers and whilst clinicians assess the best treatment options and care pathways in the light of the CAST report recommendations. And I welcome her reassurances that both NHS teams and third sector organisations are working to provide additional support to those young people. I'm also pleased to see in the Government's amendment today that they will thoroughly examine the recommendations of the CAST report and its applicability to NHS Scotland services, and that they will update Parliament on the outcome before the summer recess. Children and young people like my constituent need that certainty. It did not, of course, take the publication of the CAST report for the Government to start a broad programme of work to improve gender identity healthcare, and it's absolutely committed to that aim. Importantly, throughout that work, the Government has engaged with trans and non-binary people across Scotland who have lived experience of accessing or waiting to access gender identity services. Building on that, I know they will continue to engage directly with young people and stakeholders who represent them going forward. I hope in the heat and light of the debate and discourse that will offer them reassurance that their voices will be represented and their experiences centred in any work designed to improve their healthcare. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Hoggy. And I now call Ash Regan. Ms Regan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I thank the Conservatives for bringing this debate and Dr Hilary Cass for giving evidence to the Health Committee yesterday. 1 hour, though, is not enough to fully engage with Dr Cass's recommendations, and drastic change is urgently needed to safeguard Scottish children from what I believe is a medical scandal. Yep. The Government must urgently understand the striking difference in patient profile presenting for gender identity services from a few young boys to a large and rapidly increasing number of teenage girls with complex presentation. These are often young lesbians or autistic girls, many with serious mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, eating disorders, who may be self-harming, often caused by abuse or neglect. And we must investigate the reason for this change in patients. Girls are now increasingly opting out of womanhood, and we can't just shrug this off. We need to look at this and address it. The treatment protocol for gender identity with affirmation and that funneling towards the medical pathway overshadows these other problems and neglects, to these girls' detriment, alternative psychological treatment options. Clinicians tried to raise the alarm from inside that these girls were being harmed by an approach developed for boys. From whistleblowers like Dr David Bell and safeguarding lead Sonia Appleby, we know what happened to these clinicians. They were ignored at best and silenced at worst, and in the end, many of them left. In Cass's words, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones and even surgery may be a suitable treatment for some. We just don't know which ones. And given the severe health risks of this treatment, we need a service model that considered the child's right to an open future and offers appropriate therapeutic care to each patient. Detransitioners say that many don't understand the risks of testosterone, such as fertility loss, vaginal atrophy, clitoral growth and pain affecting sexual function. And Cass recommends that gender services learn and understand from detransitioners. This is difficult to do when many, understandably, refuse to return to the service that has failed them. We must ensure legislation, education and health services are CAS compliant. The school guidance is inappropriate and should be withdrawn. Are we sending the message that homophobia is unacceptable and that loving acceptance of our body is important? And I think the evidence would suggest otherwise. This report is a watershed moment. Vulnerable children are at its heart, and the government's motion shows it doesn't understand the severity of the problem and the urgency required to fix it. What does it imagine the outcome of a thorough examination of the most comprehensive, recent and meticulous review of the global body of research will be? The Scottish Government can prevaricate to placate lobby groups, or it can remove its ideological blinkers and focus on the urgent clinical need to improve how we provide care to support distressed children. And there is no excuse for any further delay. Maya Angelou famously said, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better."
Thank you, Ms Regan. We will now move to closing speeches, and I call on Patrick Harvey on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please, Mr Harvey.
It's not often, presiding officer, that I've got a lump in my throat these days speaking in Parliament after I've been doing it for so long. But in this debate, after so long of this Parliament having a strong and a proud track record in supporting LGBT people's equality and human rights, I feel deeply anxious that that is about to change. A number of members have spoken about the toxicity of this debate. It's been recognised that Hilary Cass has said the same. Even Megan Gallagher agrees. But I have to question whether this debate will have improved that or made it worse. I'm not sure whether Megan Gallagher, even once in her speech, mentioned transgender people as transgender people. In fact, few people who spoke in today's debate did. Claire Hockey, I think, the most notable exception to that, and I thank her for her contribution. I wanted to mention one constituent who emailed me a few days ago. I won't give any personal details, but they're a young transgender person who wrote, "I'm writing this because I'm scared. I'm writing this because I'm desperate. I'm writing this because I need transgender voices to be heard and to matter when the discussion of our identities and rights are being brought into question." Now, objectively, this debate should be about access to healthcare, waiting times, the need for a clinical pathway with better follow-up and support. Nobody would object. Certainly, transgender people angry about the poor and inadequate quality of the healthcare they can access would not object to a debate about that kind of improvement. Gillian Mackay was one of a number of members who recognised that waiting times at the moment are entirely unacceptable. But context matters. It's not just the substance of a debate on that healthcare improvement that's needed. Context matters. And the context is a wave of transphobia, with marginalised people's views rarely heard, but their lives politicised, their rights weaponised and their very existence refuted. And this debate should not ideally be about ideology, but even Dr Cass has recognised that she was probably naive in not acknowledging the prevalence of homophobia and transphobia in our society. Now, to be clear, most people in our society don't support that homophobia and transphobia. Most people do support trans people's equality, and that support is higher amongst young people, amongst women and amongst lesbian, gay and bisexual people. But that prejudice is all too prevalent in media and in politics, and it is being stirred up quite deliberately at the very top of the UK government. A Prime Minister who made a cheap transphobic gag at Prime Minister's questions, while Brianna Jai's grieving mother was sitting in the gallery. An Equalities Minister calling on the public to report organisations for not discriminating against transgender people, and putting pressure on schools to out young people to their parents even when they don't feel safe. And a Tory party here in the Scottish Parliament now targeting LGBT Youth Scotland, an organisation that we should all be proud of. And speeches here today, just as deplorable, some of them, including from those who have voted against LGBT people's human rights at every opportunity and who've even supported restrictions on reproductive rights and freedoms as well. And what all of this generates outside of politics is a wave of hostility and prejudice, the likes of which I have never experienced in my many years working and campaigning on LGBT people's human rights. I regret, Presiding Officer, that the only amendment reflecting on this political context was not selected for debate today. The Greens will support the Scottish Government amendment. We believe it's an improvement somewhat to the motion and feel the same about the Labour amendment. But neither will be enough to make the amended motion supportable. We will oppose it, just as we will try as best we can, even if we are left alone in Scottish politics, in summoning up the courage to oppose the toxic culture war which has started elsewhere and which I fear may be coming to Scotland.
Thank you, Mr Harvey. I'll now call on Cara Mochan to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 4 minutes, please, Ms Mochan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I am pleased to close tonight for Scottish Labour, and I thank members across the chamber for their contributions. I want to start by saying that I do think that, on the whole, across the Parliament, we do believe that this is a considered scientific paper and that message should go out from the Parliament. And I also want us all to reflect that if you get the opportunity to watch the hour from Dr Hilary Cass yesterday, this report has been pulled together by a clinician with an extremely caring side, and that shows throughout the whole hour. There can be no doubt that this is a subject that a lot of people feel very strongly about. It's also an issue that I think has become needlessly complex, when in reality what we want is the best and the right care available for all of those who need it. It wouldn't do to pretend that only the people concerned about this are people you deem out of touch. This is actually a big issue for a lot of people. They are discussing this issue and contact their MSPs, so we do have a responsibility to take leadership in this area. There are legitimate concerns that must be addressed in how the Government responds to the Cass report. Fortunately, Dr Cass has provided some clarity for us, and we need to heed that clarity. I want to make a short mention of our colleague Claire Baker, who as early as 2022 was asking the Parliament to look at the interim report and to show some support for the clinicians who we know were left feeling vulnerable. And that is why this Parliament, this Government, should be involved in the decisions around the Cass review. The findings of the Cass review should be implemented without delay. There are many children and young people with gender dysphoria that need some certainty, and we are in a position to provide them with it. Pausing the use of puberty blockers was the right first step in providing that certainty. My party do welcome that decision, but now we need to move forward and ensure we have quick and responsive services available to these young people, as was discussed by many members, but in particular Polly McNeill and Ruth Maguire. Can I also say that I want to just also add my thanks to people who have shared their stories so that we can get that right for future generations. Unfortunately, we recently had a government tripping over themselves on messaging and substance, and that trend, I think, did cause confusion. The confusion has affected people's lives, and it is not acceptable. And as my colleague Jackie Bailey indicated, we need some leadership, and we hope that we will get that now. I recognise there is now a new leadership in the SNP, and with that comes the opportunity to accept that there were mistakes and that we should look at more sensible approaches, and it is our position that we will make every effort to do that with the Government, as you will see from the amendment, and we do thank the Government for supporting that. We do not need another working group, I think, though, would be our message. The work has been done. Dr Cass and her team, widely respected, and there is no doubt that the evidence is good evidence in this report. Dr Cass confirmed to us that she has been discussing her work with the Minister since 2022, so there is nothing unexpected in that report. So this government knew what was coming, and the session yesterday at the Health Committee confirmed that we could be moving on. The longer we delay, the more young people experiencing seemingly endless waits, and no one wants that. I'm going to finish my remarks there because I know we're tight for time, and I thank all the members again for contributing to the debate.
Thank you. And I call on Marie Todd. Up to 5 minutes, Minister.
Presiding Officer, colleagues across the Chamber, I want to start by reflecting on the words of Dr Hilary Cass herself. She referred to the public discourse around gender identity and gender identity healthcare, describing it as increasingly toxic, ideological and polarised public debate. I think that we can all recognise that description. I think that we can all recognise that the nature of how we talk about these issues, including here in the chamber of the Scottish Parliament, really matters. It matters because toxic and polarised discourse does nothing to serve young people who are questioning their gender, nor those young people accessing gender identity healthcare, nor their families, nor the NHS staff working hard to care for them. So in my closing remarks, I also want to make a plea for a more temperate debate, with less heat and more compassion. There is much I think we can agree on across this chamber. We agree that children and young people and their well-being is at the heart of all our concern here. That's why we welcome the Cass report and recognise its significance. That is why a senior clinical team within the Office of the Chief Medical Officer in the Scottish Government is already giving careful consideration to each recommendation in the context of how NHS services in Scotland work. We agree that evidence matters. That is why we are already engaged with NHS England on the planned clinical study on puberty blockers, and why Scottish Government have already awarded funding to the University of Glasgow to establish a programme of research on long-term health outcomes for people who access gender identity healthcare in Scotland. Yes, I'll give way.
Sandish Gulhani.
Thank you to the Minister for giving way. Which of the 32 recommendations do not apply to Scotland?
Minister.
So, it is absolutely clear to everyone in this chamber that NHS Scotland is different from NHS England. We have different structures, and it is simply not possible to adopt all 32 recommendations. Recommendation 5 refers to a statutory instrument that applies only to England. Recommendation 9 refers NHS England National Provider Collaborative, which Recommendation 12 suggests is not yet established. Recommendation 11 covers commissioning and potential subcontracting by NHS England services. And Recommendation 30 covers NHS England contract management. I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the recommendations and the full report provide evidence that we can learn from in NHS Scotland. But it is simply wrong to suggest that we can wholesale adopt all 32 recommendations. Now, we agree that high-quality healthcare standards matter, and that we all want people to have safe, evidence-based, holistic healthcare. That's why we commissioned Healthcare Improvement Scotland to produce national standards for gender identity healthcare. We all agree, as the Cass review recommends, and Dr Hilary Cass highlighted when she gave evidence yesterday at this Parliament's Health and Social Care Committee, that healthcare professionals who work in both this special field and beyond need good training and support. That is why we commissioned NHS National Education for Scotland to develop a transgender healthcare knowledge and skills framework and explore resources and opportunities for training for NHS Scotland staff. And we all agree, I hope, that this is not an issue to treat as a political football. The Cass review is a serious report. It requires serious consideration. Many of its recommendations are already in train or delivered in Scotland as part of the work implementing the Strategic Action Framework for NHS Gender Identity Healthcare Services. There will be more that we can learn too. I'm afraid I'm in my closing moments. So that is why, through the work of the senior multidisciplinary team of Scottish Government clinical advisors, we are already thoroughly examining the recommendations of the NHS England commissioned report and its applicability to NHS Scotland services, and we will update Parliament on the outcome before summer recess. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on Sandesh Gilhani to wind up the debate. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. I wish to draw members' attention to my register of interest as a practising NHS GP. Presiding officer, the Cass review was commissioned by NHS England 4 years ago, with the Scottish Government getting updates from 2022. This is an authoritative body of work. Researchers met with an extensive range of stakeholders, including professionals, their respected governing organisations and those with lived experience, both directly and through support of advocacy groups. The Cass review made 32 recommendations. It concluded that children are being let down by both a lack of research and weak evidence on medical interventions on gender care. In Health Committee yesterday, Dr Cass set the record straight on claims made by critics of the review, such as Patrick Harvey and Ross Greer, who relied on significant misinformation to push their agenda. The claim that Dr Cass disregarded 98% of papers presented to researchers is false. We believe the Cass review is a valid scientific document, and the science doesn't change just because you cross the River Tweed. Megan Gallagher was absolutely correct in pointing out that the SNP Green government dithered and delayed responding and making a decision about the final version of the Cass review, and thank God clinicians were brave enough to stop puberty blockers. Ash Regan's intervention for the CMO to appear before Parliament is important. Why can we not get at least an interim statement and get the CMO to answer questions? Jenny Minto stated that they were not waiting on this report, but it is really clear they did not pause puberty blockers. And as Jackie Bailey reminded us, the SNP government has had meetings with Dr Cass throughout. Gillian Mackay's contribution seems to have left out the fact that Dr Cass said there was poor evidence for puberty blockers and that there must be a multidisciplinary team approach to ensure mental health and other issues are addressed. Stigma has no place in society, as Alex Cole-Hamilton said, but I disagree with Alex Cole-Hamilton about where decisions can be taken. For example, MESH was ceased by this Parliament, not clinicians, and it is possible, when the interim report was produced, for the government to pause puberty blockers and take time to discuss it with clinicians to make sure we got the right decisions. Murdo Fraser brought up the brave story of Sinead. Dr Cass addressed this by saying irreversible medication must not be given quickly to children, but via an MDT approach, addressing any other issues they have. We must apologise to Sinead Watson, Richie Herron and others let down by the gender service they received. Nobody here denies trans people exist. Nobody here denies trans people's rights. But nobody's rights trumps other people's rights. We must all live together. Presiding officer, Dr Hilary Cass gave evidence to the Health Committee yesterday and was very generous with her time. We heard that children are gender fluid, not fixed. Puberty blockers are irreversible. Significant time and effort went into funding all research in the area. Most importantly, the evidence is simply not there to continue giving these irreversible drugs. Why must the government insist children are labelled? Let children be children. Let children experience life. Let children learn. Never forget, children are vulnerable, and it is our job to protect them. Scottish children will be forever and irreversibly harmed. The Green Amendment that was rejected shows that this Green Party are science deniers. The Green Party care only about dogma, only about ideology. The same party who describes Scots who don't agree with their views as reactionaries and bigots. And this was the position of the SNP as well. We must base our approach upon evidence. It is not transphobic to question or review current pathways. Ideology and dogma has no place in medical treatment. We must protect patients who are vulnerable. We must protect our children. And it is right doctors have paused the Sanderford Clinic. But we need an urgent response to this report from the government, and we must implement the recommendations in full. Or will the SNP bow down to green dogma and remain beholden to them? Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on implementing the cash review in Scotland, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business. I'll just allow a moment for front benches to organise themselves.